Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. In this episode, I'm going to be talking with astrologer Demetra George about a recent archaeological discovery of the earliest Greco-Roman woman that we know of who was a practicing astrologer whose name was Heliodora. Hey, Demetra, welcome back to the show.
Chris, I know this is a very exciting episode to be part of, is bringing the name of a woman astrologer from the ancient time period into the modern era.
Yeah, so this is like a kind of a big discovery that we didn't know about that was actually recently unearthed through archaeology, where three researchers published a paper in 2021 that I just discovered recently last month, where up until recently, even though we knew that there were women that practiced astrology in the ancient world, there weren't very many specific names that we knew of until many centuries later. But now all of a sudden, they've discovered the tombstone of a woman who lived in Egypt in the 2nd or 3rd century CE. And it says that she was actually a practicing astrologer.
I know that is so important for all of the contemporary women doing astrology now, because over the years of teaching Hellenistic astrology, and we would go on about Valens and Ptolemy and the Chepso and Petasiris and all of the others, and there would always be questions in the audience like, well, where are the women? Weren't there any women astrologers? Don't you have any of their names? And we'd have to say, sadly, no, we don't have the names. We are not aware of them. And there was like this crestfallen disappointment that would happen over the audience. So this is monumental, truly, to begin to have this beginning point. And as we'll see, like we've sort of found a few other women also that we'll tell you about that have astrological-like connections.
Yeah, and it's also so different compared to modern times, where it's like the majority of the practitioners and the majority of the people that use astrology are women. So it's so weird then going into ancient astrology, where in terms of the surviving sources up until now, it's been so much reversed or so much the opposite in some ways.
Right. I think at least part of that is that education was not readily available to ordinary women. If one came from a wealthy family and had an enlightened father, those daughters might be educated, but for ordinary women, it was felt their job was to bear children and take care of families, and so it was useless. So that women didn't have access to the kinds of mathematics or reading or thinking or learning that would have allowed them to become astrologers. And secondly, for most women, it was frowned upon to have a profession outside of one's marriage, that a respectable woman did not have a job or go to work. And if women did, it was because of poverty and necessity. So I think those two factors of education and what it was permissible for respectable women to do closed the doors for many women who might have otherwise gone into the profession.
Right. But at the same time, we do know that women were clients of astrologers or saw astrologers. And recently there have been some horoscopes that were discovered in Demotic Egyptian from the 1st century BCE, and they represent some of the earliest horoscopes or birth charts that have survived. Right. And one of the things that I noted is that I think at least 2 or 3 of the clients were women, which means that some of the earliest horoscopes that survive were actually birth charts cast for women, presumably clients.
Yeah. And it was during Roman times that women had many more freedoms and a more open lifestyle than they had in definitely classical period Greece. If it was in the 1st centuries BC, I guess the Romans would have just taken over Egypt at that time. So be curious if we knew if there were Roman citizens in Egypt or Egyptian women, or what their social status was that allowed them and gave them the opportunity to seek astrological advice.
Right. Yeah. And then we also know from some of the handbooks of the astrologers that survive, like Vedius Valens, or especially recently Firmicus Maternus, that they'll have references where usually when they're instructing somebody how to interpret a birth chart, oftentimes the default is for a man, but then they'll say, and then the same principle applies to women, or they'll say sometimes, or you have to look at the chart from this perspective if for a woman, and it's different for a man or a woman in certain techniques. So there was an awareness and sometimes instructions about how to delineate a chart for a woman, because that was presumably like a pretty common occurrence.
Yeah. Yes, that's absolutely right. So that you can find that material. And if you're like looking specifically for the variations for a woman's chart, then often you have to read carefully through the text to find those places where it will state that.
Right. Like one of the common areas is they'll say that Venus signifies marriage in a man's chart, but in a woman's chart, they'll say that Mars signifies marriage. Yeah. So elsewhere, it's like when I was researching this for my book, because I had a chapter on all the major Hellenistic astrologers, and I created a brief section talking about some of the few references to women astrologers that were known at that point, back when I published that in 2017. And one of the ones that I found was from the 1st century in Juvenal's Satires, where he's sort of satirizing Roman society and the idea of women that consult with astrologers so much that they become proficient in it, and they start becoming astrologers themselves and seeing clients. So he says, at one point he says, be sure to keep out of the way of that type too. You will see her carrying around in her hands, like a ball of scented amber, a well-thumbed ephemeris. She no longer consults, but rather she herself is consulted. When her husband is leaving for camp or home, she will not go too, if Thrasyllus and his calculations detain her. When she decides to travel a mile, a suitable hour is produced from her book. So there it's like, yeah.
That's wonderful. That's really brilliant.
Yeah.
You can see the image. And of course, the first line, like, be careful to stay out of the way of this woman, this kind of woman.
Yeah, stay away from her.
Derision toward women who actually did that. But it's beautiful, a woman walking around holding an ephemeris like a scented ball of amber. I would love you to have your AI thing create a painting of a Roman woman carrying an ephemeris like a scented ball of amber.
Okay, yeah, I'll see if I can come up with something.
If you come up with it. It would just be brilliant to send that image around.
Right. And so, it also, as a reference there to Thrasyllus, like one of the most famous astrologers of the Greco-Roman period, who worked for the Emperor Tiberius.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk a little bit about their family line, because they had a family line of astrologers and different men and women over the course of like two at least centuries. So we have the reference to Thrasyllus there, and then also to even electional astrology, to like choosing an auspicious hour to depart for something or to do something. And the idea that that's one of the ways that women would be using astrology by the 1st century. All right. So that's like some of the context. And then aside from that, up until recently, the other earliest names that we knew of were people like Hypatia in the 4th century or 5th century, which was like a maybe that she would have had some training in astrology, since she did have background in astronomy. And then I did a previous episode also on Queen Buran, who lived in the 9th century in Baghdad.
Yes.
And I did that episode with Ali Alumi, and we talked about her having these legends surrounding her and her skill with astrology and using it in order to like avoid an assassination plot on the caliph at the time. But that's all the way in the 9th century. So that just gives you some idea of, the gaps in our knowledge up until recently, which is part of the reason or part of the context of why this discovery is so important and is so striking, since this is a specific named person from the 2nd or 3rd century CE. All right, so let me pull out the article. So the title of the article is The Funerary Stela of Heliodora, Astrologer. Let me put it up on the screen, by Roger S. Bagnall, Kathy Calloway, and Alexander Jones. And if people just Google the title, you'll come up with links where you can read this article yourself. And what you'll see there is what they've discovered is essentially the tombstone of a woman from the 2nd, that they think is what lived in the 2nd or 3rd century. And this is what it looks like from Greco-Roman Egypt. And the tombstone has a picture of her. She's like reclining on a couch with 2 pillows underneath her arm. She's holding a cup, and there's a little jackal, which is probably connected with the god Anubis, off to her left, which was like the god of the underworld, or the god that sort of helped people that were heading to the underworld. And then below that, there's an inscription which gives her name and talks a little bit and gives some epithets for her and for her life. So here it is, and it's written in Greek. And the text, the translation, it says, Heliodora, astrologer, chaste, without reproach, virgin, brother loving, about 52 years old. Farewell. So
what happened to be of courage?
I mean, I changed it because the literal translation is be of good courage, but it also, in a lot of the inscriptions and one of the other entries in the Liddell and Scott lexicon, was said when it's used in that context, it means the equivalent to us of essentially like farewell.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's the only thing we have that records her. But what's notable about this is usually on these tombstones, they don't frequently list the person's profession. They don't usually have say a lot about the person. But what's unique here is that it both says her profession, that she was a woman who practiced astrology, and then it gives a number of other little points about her life and what she was like. So this then becomes the earliest, at least in terms of the Greco-Roman or Egyptian astrological tradition, like the earliest reference to a woman practicing astrology that we know of, at least by name.
Okay, so there are a lot of other pieces to the story that we can tease out of both what you said and what some of the things that the article went on to say.
Yeah, I mean, one of them is the mathematike, because it calls her a mathematike, and I thought that might be our first point to talk about.
Right, that the mathematike is the feminine version of mathematikos, which is the masculine. It meant someone who does calculations, but that was the term that was used for astrologers, because astrologers were always doing numbers that were necessary in order to erect the chart. And so there we have that first sort of almost beautiful piece of insight into what was the primary and most fundamental work of being an astrologer, was knowing the mathematicos, knowing the mathematics that allowed one to erect the chart.
Right. So that's really important. So it calls her a mathematike, and that was in that time period, especially in the first and second and third centuries, just like mathematics was the common term that was used to refer to both astrologers as well as the practice of astrology, just because of how much math and how much calculations were used. Which, prior to modern times, prior to the invention of computers, all astrologers had to know how to calculate a chart by hand. And there was a lot of different math and calculations involved in doing that.
Right. And that was so important, because if you wanted to learn astrology, if you wanted to be an astrologer, the first thing you had to do is learn how to do the math to erect the chart. If you couldn't learn or figure out how to do the math, that was the end of your career in astrology. There wasn't any place else that you could go. This was pre-computers and before you could get the chart online, or before there was astrological software, before there were computers. And to a certain point, before you could even send away to someone else to get it. That was something that wasn't possible until the early 1980s. And so that's the critical, first principle of astrology is the mathematicos.
Yeah. So that's really important. And, even recently, Ben, in the episode just before this on Firmicus Maternus, Firmicus titled his book Mathesis, and commonly refers to astrology as mathematics, essentially. So it wasn't just an occasional thing, but sometimes it became just the common or the standard term in that time period, almost to the extent that that was like the fancier term that astrologers themselves preferred to use sometimes for astrology.
Well, even Sextus Empiricus, who was a little bit later, he was the 2nd, 3rd century CE, when he was writing his work as a skeptic, criticizing all of the forms of knowledge, of being unable to know anything with certainty. That one of the fields of knowledge that he included was astrology. And when you get various translations of it, or you're looking to find citations, sometimes you'll see that book titled Against the Astrologers, but other times in a more literal way, it's against the mathematicos. And so the mathematicos was the more academic title for the astrologer that continued to be used as by philosophers as the time period went on.
Right. I'm just saving. I have a quote about that actually from Sextus's own work. Let me share it. Here it is. So this is from the introduction to his text against his polemical text against the astrologers. So he opens by defining what he's going to focus on. And he says, it is astrology or mathematics that is the investigation lying before us, is about, not the complete kind that consists of arithmetic and geometry, nor the predictive ability possessed by the followers of Eudoxus, Hipparchus, and the like, which some also call astronomy, but against nativity telling, which the Chaldeans dress up with more solemn names when they call themselves mathematicians and astrologers, elaborately insulting ordinary life, erecting a great deal of superstition against us, and not letting us use proper reasoning to achieve anything. So, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to ask, in the very first 2 words, it's astronomy or mathematics. Do you know if they use the word astronomia, where they had astronomy, or did the translator put that in? That might be something you can check when you get the original text.
I don't have the Greek text in front of me right now, but I can
Yeah.
look it up. Is this it? Oh yeah, I actually have the Greek text right here. So that's funny. In the first one, it says astrologias a mathematikeis,
Okay.
and then later when it mentions the Chaldeans and what they call themselves, it says mathematicus kai astrologos. Oh yeah, and earlier when he's talking about Eudoxus and
Mhm.
Hipparchus, he does use the Greek term astronomion, so
Okay.
astronomers.
Okay.
So already there's starting to be like a differentiation there that
Mhm.
he's drawing between astrologer and astronomer.
Right. Because in many texts, the word for astronomia or astronomias is also interchangeable with the word for astrologer.
Yeah, it seemed like because in the Mesopotamian tradition, the astronomers and the astrologers were one and the same, and there wasn't like a differentiation. But
Mhm.
then in the Greco-Roman tradition, it seems like they started to diverge, and um, but there was still a lack of standardization about what word
Yeah.
to use for one or the other.
Mhm.
So um, yeah, so Sextus Empiricus, and then even that actually brings up an important point that even like the Greek god of astrology or goddess of astrology was a woman.
Right. Well, that was Urania, who was one of the 9 muses. And the muses were sort of the spirits of divine inspiration that ruled over the different music and poetry and drama. And Urania was the eldest of the muses, and she both was of astronomy / astrology, as well as music. And her son was Linus, who was credited with the invention of melody. And we have the fusion in Urania of music and astronomy, the so-called like harmony of the spheres. I mean, the notion that the planets and their orbits are creating a huge symphony in the heavens. But going back to Urania, she is depicted in ancient statues, often holding a globe of the world in one hand and a measuring compass in the other hand, by which she is measuring off the world coming from the heavenly realm. And later on, we may talk about this notion of measuring cords for the heavens being brought down to earth.
Oh yeah, we might as well mention that now actually because that would be a good um, just as a digression, even though the episode's not about that. But recently in a lecture on his Patreon, Ali A. Alumi mentioned a much earlier woman named Enheduanna from Mesopotamia, who's one of who was a poet and priestess who wrote one of the earliest texts that survives.
Mhm.
And in that text, it talks about her using a measuring cord to measure out the heavens, which he pointed out then would be connected with astronomy and astrology.
Yes. Enheduanna is a poet. She's the author of the hymns of Inanna, and that we know, and she was the daughter of King Sargon. So she was a priestess of the city of Ur. So again, she existed at the highest of social levels, being head priestess and the daughter of a king. And there are tablets associating her with consulting tablets and measuring off the heavens. Around this time period, there was a dream of Gudea, who was another king of Mesopotamia. And in his dream, he was told to build a temple. And at the goddess Nanshi's shrine was another goddess, Nasiba, and that she was studying a tablet of stars to build a temple in accordance with the stars. And so the notion of Enheduanna, who holds measuring cords, is connected with both astronomy, because she measures off the heavens and surveying on earth so that the temples are built in accordance with the alignments of the stars and planets. And this takes us back to the 2100 BCE in Mesopotamia. So we have this notion of women as astronomers who are connected with bringing down the heavens into earth in the shapes of the temples they build to honor the gods, who are the planetary and celestial deities themselves. And then there's a parallel to that with the Egyptian goddess Seshat, who is attested to from this early on the Second Dynasty. And she was involved with wisdom. She was a scribe, an astronomer, and she was the wife of Thoth, who became the composite with the Greek god Hermes for Hermes Trismegistus. So Seshat was the feminine counterpart of that archetype. And from the Second Dynasty, we go back to almost 3000 BC. She's associated with stretching the cord ritual. And the cord was like a piece of string that was tied in knots at certain increments, so you could measure that. And she also used that cord in order to align astronomical alignments with the building of temples. Mm-hmm. So we have between these two goddesses that were, I want to say, roughly contemporary within 500 years or so, one in Mesopotamia and one in Egypt, that women who are priestesses of goddesses or goddesses themselves were observers of the heavens and involved in bringing down the heavens into their earthly sacred buildings and structures. And the cord, the measuring cord, is the key sort of emblem or symbol of that process.
Got it. Okay. And so that's really early. That's like 2000 BCE.
Right.
And then moving forward, by like the 7th or 5th century BCE, I know there was a student of yours that did a paper on another perhaps notable figure that could have been relevant in terms of some of this history as well, right?
Right. This is Nadia Anderson, who I did my classic studies at the University of Oregon. She was one of my fellow classmates, and we've remained friends since that time. And she has taken all 3 of the Hellenistic astrology retreat intensives. And part of the certifications from that is writing a historical paper. And so the paper that Nadia wrote was on Aglaonice or Aglaonice. It is spelled Aglaonice. And if you break that down, Aglo means bright or shining or beautiful. And the Nike is a variation of Nike, the goddess of victory. And so just like Heliodora is the gift of the sun, Aglaonice. And here are images of her. And she was known to bring down the moon, which is a code for knowledge of being able to predict eclipses. The Greek historian Plutarch in the 1st century CE wrote about her. Plutarch was a historian, and he was also a priest of Apollo at the Temple of Delphi, which was the great divination site of the ancient world. And he wrote about Aglaonice from Thessaly, who was a skilled astronomer that knew about the timing and prediction of eclipses. Now, there are many pieces of this story that are fascinating to me. And this idea that they were women, and Thessaly is in the north central part of Greece. It has long been known for its profusion of medicinal plants, and that the women of Thessaly were known as pharmakis, Pharmakis is the Greek transliteration, and that's been translated as witches by later people, but the literal translation is healers or botanical medicine women, and we get the word pharmaceutical for that. So these were women who knew the medicinal properties and all the plants to be able to make medicines, as well as poisons and their antidotes, the whole pharmacopoeia, so to speak. And knowledge of the phases of the moon was a critical piece in ancient medicine making for the timing of when to pick the plants, when to pick the roots, when to make the medicines, how long to make them sit. A lot of that was connected with lunar timing. And so that there is a tradition of the women of Thessaly of having some kind of intimate knowledge of the moon, and in particular with eclipses, that Aglaonice was very, her name comes down, Plutarch said in many books, like you've read about her. The knowledge of the women of Thessaly being able to bring down the moon goes back at least into the 5th century BC. We don't know what Aglaonice could have lived slightly earlier than Plutarch, who wrote about her, the 1st century, or she could have lived in the 3rd century BC or even the 4th. But in the 5th century, the Greek writers Aristophanes, Plato, Hippocrates all spoke about the women the women of Thessaly who knew how to bring down the moon from heavens. And they associated that. Aristophanes, in one of his plays, he was a comedian, said, oh, if I could hire someone to do this, like the women of Thessaly, I could capture the moon and put it in a box, and the new moon would never come, and I wouldn't have to pay my debts on the 1st of the month. So everyone in the audience laughed because they had enough knowledge of what that entailed, and also saw the sort of wicked humor in that line. But Plato, Hippocrates wrote that women who know how to do this are impious, who are using divine healing rather than physical healing. And he associated that with the women of Thessaly who bring down the moon in order to effect healings by divine means. And Plato also said, women who do this is subversive, it's going against the natural order of things. So on one hand, there was an awareness by classical writers as early as the 5th century that women in Thessaly were doing all kinds of things, knowing how to bring down the power of the moon or working with lunar and eclipse cycles, but they didn't like it. And it's part of the misogyny of men fearing women who have power that they may think is magical, or they don't understand, or they feel threatened by. But that's a sort of a feminist perspective. But shifting back to the astrological perspective, were those women doing astrology several centuries before Hellenistic astrology as we know it took shape in Egypt? And there's no evidence that they were casting charts. They were looking at planets and signs with rulerships. They were looking at houses or aspects or lots. But they were exhibiting this knowledge that the certain celestial events and the ability to predict when they would happen had relevance to either effects that would then happen in the terrestrial realm, or using that time in order to influence events that could happen through the rituals that they did. And this is definitely a form of astrological-like thinking, as well as astromagical thinking, that was going on in Greece centuries before the kind of Hellenistic astrology that we take now as being the format was being done. And so Aglaonice, whose name was given to us by Plutarch, is one of our links to women doing astrology. And I think I hate to call it folk astrology, but certainly in the Middle Ages, when astrology died down in the West because no one could read the text anymore, people were still using phases of the moon for planting and building and marrying. And so this idea of lunar cycles was a continuum that was often held by ordinary people, and especially with the moon's role in childbirthing, could have been particularly by women.
Yeah, right. And also, even just to the extent, if there are women that were familiar with the ability to predict eclipses astronomically, and the extent to which that was derived from the Mesopotamian tradition, because it was the Mesopotamians that had a long history of observational astronomy as well as mathematical astronomy, whereas the Greeks were relative latecomers to that. Some of that knowledge probably, if it was passed on to Greek women, was probably coupled with or was packaged to some extent with some of the knowledge of Mesopotamian omen astrology as well.
Right. And this is something that Nadia Anderson goes into some detail in her paper. And perhaps we'll be able to get a copy of that available from her. But she did some research that showed in one of the letters to King Esarhaddon, who is an Assyrian king. And he was one of the kings who believed in astrology, and it was from his library that we have the texts he had. But ziggurats their pyramid-shaped buildings were astronomical observatories. And he had people taking the celestial omens and every day running to his capital at Nineveh, giving him advice based on the omens. And in one of the letters that was sent, it was about a potential enemy in north of him in Syria. And there was a reference to, it was either the messengers or the people whom his messenger had spoken to. And it made the allusion to, and their women are always bringing down the moon from the heavens. And so in the 7th century BC in Mesopotamia, we still have this notion of women having the knowledge of eclipses and the omen qualities of it being potentially a dangerous time for kings through the prediction of those eclipses.
Okay.
Right. And it's, to what extent was that knowledge transferred to Greece? It was eventually, at what point? And based on Nadia's work and my own research, that could be another whole conversation, but I think we've said sufficient here.
Sure. Yeah. And then you mentioned briefly the oracle at Delphi, and that's another tradition of women being involved in divination as well.
Right. And that was certainly not astrology, but it was more of a direct perception. And in the work of both Plato and Cicero, they spoke about two main branches of divination. One was direct, And that was when the mind of the diviner had a direct communication with the mind of the deity. And that was the kind, for the most part, that was the kind of divination that happened at Delphi. There were two Greek words used in connection with that, of ekstasis, from which we get ecstasy, and enthusiasmos, from which we get our word enthusiasm. And first, the priestesses would go into a state of ecstasy, meaning to step outside of themselves, ek meaning out of, and stasis is standing. And then they would be filled with enthusiasma. And an is in, and thu is the root word for God. So they would be filled with the divine spirit. And from that, they would give their oracle, their response to the suppliant who had come to the temple to request that spiritual guidance. The other branch was indirect divination, and that was through the observation of signs in nature, and like augury and liver divination, and the direction of smoke over ritual fire or part of that. And it was looking through, and the chickens that the Roman soldiers traveled with, that they'd throw out feed in whatever directions the chickens went to eat, like, and that's the direction they would go into battle for the next day. But those were all secondary through signs of nature, where there was the belief that the deity who is giving the spiritual guidance put their answer in the entrails of an animal that was about to be sacrificed, or they put their direction, their guidance in the direction of the smoke that would flow from the ritual fire, or so on. And astrology was a curious blend between the two, because on one hand, one is looking at the movements of the planets themselves, so that there's an intermediary between the astrologer and the insight. But to the extent that the planets were believed, at least in the Mesopotamian period, to be the emanations of the deities themselves, then one could say that the astrologer, through communing with the planet, was receiving that direct communication. And so astrology, being known as both an art and a science, carries both of those elements of working through that direct, the inspired voice, and the indirect, like knowing how to calculate the chart and what the symbols mean and how one puts that together. And there's rules about that.
Right. Yeah.
Right. But the oracles at Delphi were doing the direct communication. And it's interesting that Plutarch, who's a classical scholar, wrote all these essays and histories and biographies, himself was a priest of Apollo at the Temple of Delphi. And so he was involved in having access, or at least knowing about that tradition of the kind of divine knowledge that comes in a direct manner.
Got it. Okay. So, and that's the direct manner of divination versus like the artificial or provoked manner of divination, which astrology later would fall into more of the category of, because it involves all of those, the calculations of the planets, and it's a more technical form of divination.
Right. Yeah, technical. I would definitely use the word technical, techne, rather than provoked. Provoked is the seer is either asked a question. So you have a client that asks an astrologer a question, and then the astrologer gives the answer, and that's provoked. It's asked for. The unprovoked is spontaneous, where the astrologer, without being asked, has this vision of what some planetary alignment is going to portend, and then waxes on about that.
Right. That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay. So circling back around to Heliodora.
Oh, yeah. There's lots more that can be said about her.
Yeah. So let's locate her geographically and in terms of her time period. So they found this tomb stone. One of the things about it is that it was acquired by a museum in 2011, and it was previously owned by a private collector who got it at some point earlier in the 20th century, probably from a collector or a dealer from Cairo. And you can actually now see the tombstone. It's housed at the University of Missouri.
Almost.
Sorry?
It's you can almost see it. You can't actually see it right now.
Oh, it's not on display?
Right. One of my astrologer friends in Eugene, Molly Niffen, her family lives in Missouri, and she went there recently for a visit. And I told her, like, go to Columbia, go to this place and look at this image. And when she called to make sure it was there, they told her they were in the process of moving the building, moving the art exhibits they had in that building to some other site, so that they weren't available for viewing at this very moment.
Okay.
So lest anyone in that area suddenly gets in their car right after listening to this episode and hightails it off to see Heliodora, call first and see when and where she'll be on display again.
Okay, got it. Yeah, well, I hope once it is on display again, somebody gets some good pictures or some better pictures than the one that we have, which are okay, but they're a little pixelated. But so let's talk about the geographical and the time frame. So we're talking about Egypt in the 2nd or 3rd century CE. So this is a period several hundred years after Alexander the Great conquered Egypt, and then there were installed a series of Greek-speaking rulers that took over Egypt for the next several hundred years, the Ptolemies. And then by the 1st century BCE, we get the Roman Empire takes over Egypt, famously when Antony and Cleopatra lost the battle against Octavian or Augustus, and that ended the Ptolemaic family line when Cleopatra and Antony committed suicide. So then from that point forward, we have the Roman Empire that's in control of Egypt. And there we have the foundation of like Alexandria and the Library of Alexandria and some of the things associated with it. And we also get Egypt becomes the birthplace essentially of horoscopic astrology, or what we sometimes call Hellenistic astrology, which is the system of astrology that uses the planets and the signs of the zodiac, the concept of aspects, and the concept of the 12 houses all together, primarily in order to interpret birth charts. So that's part of the context of Egypt, is Egypt became the home essentially of this type of natal astrology that we're all familiar with as, roughly what we sometimes call Western astrology. And around that time frame of the 2nd or 3rd century CE, that's roughly also the time frame of some of the most famous astrologers like Vedius Valens or Claudius Ptolemy, and different figures like that, who are also living in Egypt, probably in Alexandria.
Right. So that's fascinating that Heliodora was most likely living not most likely, but was possibly living at the same time as Valens and Ptolemy. Right. And can you show that map? Did you have the map of where the town was, Terenuthis? Did I see you flash that as one of your images?
Yeah, so here's one on Wikipedia. It's kind of small, and I think if I click it, it'll not show it on the map, of course.
Okay. I was thinking of the map that was in the paper, but I can just talk about it.
No, here it is.
Okay. Yeah, so you see where Terenuthis is on the left-hand side of the Nile Delta. And the article talks about how that was a major crossroads between coming from Cairo, or what it was known as Memphis, as being the capital from the south, and from Alexandria in the north. And it was a critical junction that led out into the Wadi Natrum, which was the desert where an important mineral was found that was used both in the glassmaking and the textiles. So you have this as an important juncture of trade and traffic. And where trade and traffic happen, there's also the transmission of ideas. It was also in this town that there was a temple of Hathor. And I think in previous episodes where Chris talked about the temple of Hathor in Dendera in Egypt, that's where we have some of the most complete Egyptian zodiacs, both the round zodiac with the signs and the planets and their exaltations, but there are also at least a half a dozen other rectangular strips of zodiacs from that temple that display different astronomical phenomena that haven't been publicized as much. So the fact that this was an important center of exchange of ideas and commerce, and there was a Hathor temple there, places it in the midst of possible astrological vibrancy. And so this is part of the setting for Heliodora being there.
Right. I also noticed on the map that it's not very far geographically from another town that's recently important called Athribis,
Yes.
which is just right over there to the right of Terenuthis, where Heliodora was from. And Athribis is a place where there've been some papers published recently where some Demotic Egyptian birth charts have been discovered, which contain lots or contain the astrological lots or Arabic parts and other concepts that are common to Hellenistic astrology. So it's interesting just geographically in terms of other hotspots for astrology that have come up recently in terms of archaeological discoveries.
Right. When I saw where that was on the map, I had to smile, remembering the line from Valens, where he was searching for Time Lord methods that might work. And he said he traveled all over Egypt looking for esteemed teachers, and went, looked for teachers in the Egyptian deserts. And I thought that, well, that would have been like a natural route for him to have gone on from Alexandria to Terenuthis, and then to connect with routes that went out into the desert. And, what if he had met Heliodora? They were living at the same time. And if he was seeking out teachers, he may have been drawn to either her or whoever she learned astrology from in that area. And I would love to see a movie, a historical fiction book, Netflix docu series on the fictional meeting of Valens and Heliodora.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm just being sort of frivolous here, but nevertheless, it is something that certainly was in the realm of possible encounters.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, he went to Egypt. He was supposed to be from Antioch, and he traveled to Egypt, to the home and the birthplace of astrology in many ways. And then he was looking for different teachers, and he tried out different people, but he wasn't super happy with some of the techniques that he learned. But then, and he gave up for a period of time. But then eventually he said that he was too drawn to, the mystery of trying to unlock, the key to astrology. So he went searching again, and he found a teacher that he says was a certain lover of learning who taught him this advanced Time Lord technique.
Yeah, I found that paragraph when I was looking for it. And I was just kind of stunned that he said that he's going about looking and being frustrated. He said, and this is Smith's translation, until the wish for heavenly visitation brought about through a kind of providence the transmission in a certain place through a certain lover of learning. And so it was almost as if you have the line in Thessalus of Thales, who went to the Egyptian temple and requested a visitation, a vision. And then he was able to ask the priest about the teachings of Nechepso and Petasiris. So almost as if Valens is making the same kind of allusion that the insights he had were through an encounter with a lover of learning, and that facilitated a visitation. So it could have been someone visited him, or it could have been more of a sort of Gnostic, what's the word, the direct knowledge visitations, the experience.
Right, like a transmission of
Yeah,
gnosis, of like
of gnosis.
knowing.
Yeah. The direct communication, the oracle, where there's that direct communication from the mind of the divine to the mind of the diviner.
Yeah, I've been reading about that recently because it seems like a lot of the early astrological texts from the tradition with Nechepso and Petasiris and Asclepius were written as like revelations of this knowledge from like Agathos Daimon to Hermes, and then from Hermes to Asclepius, but that different ones may have framed it, like the Nechepso and Petasiris text, part of it may have been framed as like a revelation that they received about the true nature of the cosmos from some higher like spirit or being.
Yes, and that's not unlike the Quran that was received by direct revelation. And Tibetan Buddhism talks about all of these mind termas of ancient teachings that are received through this direct revelation and the mind stream of the spiritual teacher. So it was definitely one of the forms of how the recipients of ancient spiritual knowledge claimed that knowledge came to them.
Right. Yeah. Firmicus last month, and reading Ben's translation of Firmicus, is constantly talking about the divine mind and talking about the that Hermetic and Neoplatonist idea of like directly connecting with something that's above the physical world, and how the divine mind is like above that and is something that you want to like return to, or that when a person dies, their soul ascends through the planetary spheres and gives up certain qualities in order to return back to the source. Yeah. So with Heliodora, we're talking about Egypt in the 2nd or 3rd century. And her, one of the things the authors of the articles talk about is that she's displayed with a mixture of Greek and Egyptian motifs in the illustration, right?
Yes, right. So as I found it fascinating that they said her hairstyle was Egyptian, and that it looked like either she had a cap or a turban, or either that the was braided really close to her scalp, and then the hairstyle comes down behind her ears in a series of curls or of braids. However, her dress was a Greek dress. So here we have a blend of, and it brings up, well, was she Egyptian? Was she Greek? The reality was that there was a fusion of Greco-Egyptian traditions happening at this time.
Right. Last month in the Egyptian astrology episode I did with Ian Moyer, we talked about some of the this like family of coffins, this family that had these coffin lids that had zodiacs inscribed on them, and how you could see a few generations of this family lineage and different ones had Greek names or Egyptian names, and there were some instances where one would have like a Greek father but an Egyptian mother. And so over the course of centuries, there's just these different blendings of these different cultures and these different family lines, so that, you know, it's not necessarily one or the other, but sometimes it's like
Right.
both.
Both. And we see elements of that, at least how she's depicted in her funerary stela.
Right.
Do you,
So
no, go on. This, you know, I wanted to continue that conversation a little bit
go ahead.
of the Greek Egyptian.
So other elements on the left is like people usually, some of the just like normal people I posted this last month thought it was a cat, but on the left, the animal is probably a jackal, which is
Right.
connected with the Egyptian god Anubis, right?
Right. And he's the god of the underworld, the conveyor of the souls of the dead. And so he's very much a funerary symbol. And then the authors of the article said she's holding a cup. If it was like from a Greek representation, it would be receiving a drink. But if it was an Egyptian symbol, it would be offering a libation. And so is she offering a libation to Anubis? Of sometimes like libations are put into the ground during rituals or burials as offerings to the gods of the underworld, to be able to receive the dead. So again, there's that ambiguity happening in her imagery. But then you have, the inscription. And why don't you go through the inscription a little bit?
Okay. Well, and then the last thing, just in terms of the images, was there's like a banquet below her that has like either some flowers or some wheat. There's like a pot or a cup that might be on like a tripod, and different stuff like that that's kind of inscribed right below her. And a lot of these are very common motifs for this type of like tombstone.
Right. And that's to do with you always, after the funerals, you invite people over to eat. There's always, and there's the food of the dead being offered at burials as well in traditional societies. So the food is, and the banquet table is an intricate part of funerary rituals in many different cultures.
Okay. And then the very last thing is just, especially for like the audio listeners, there's two like Greek sort of style columns on either side of her. And then at the top, the sort of pointed or triangular top of a building above her. All right. So let's get into the inscription more. So one of the things in terms of the inscription is it says that she was 52 years old, or about 52 years old when she died. But one of the things that makes clear is one of the things the authors of the paper emphasize is that it's not super common for somebody to have their profession even listed next to their name, man or woman. It's especially uncommon to see astrologer listed, especially for a woman. But then one of the things they gave some numbers for was that it was also incredibly rare for her to be noted as being not married, for an unmarried woman at the age of like 52 years old. And they speculated that this may have been connected with her choice of profession, in that they gave some numbers, and it was something like 93 or 90%, 96% of women by the late 20s or early 30s were all married. So that Heliodora would have fallen into a very small percentage of women that were not married, which is in and of itself really notable here.
Right. I know that at least in early medieval times, if for some men who wanted to become philosophers or scholars, like Abelard, and the learning was under the auspices of the church, they had to take vows of chastity. They couldn't get married. And certainly if one was a priestess, and some of those words that were used, beyond reproach and chaste, were words that may have been used for the Vestal virgins in Rome who tended the sacred flame and were unmarried. And again, chastity was part of becoming initiated into a spiritual vocation. And that often it was the temples that were places of where learning was available to women if they didn't come from upper class families who had a value on that. So in looking at some of those inscriptions to her, I wondered if being unmarried, being chaste, being beyond reproach were indications that she may have been a temple priestess of some sort. But our paper said it was impossible that she learned astrology in a temple. And I'm assuming they meant an Egyptian temple. And then, right, and that got me to wondering, well, maybe it was because she was Greek and the other name, Philadelphos, of brother loving, was a name that had been used by all the Ptolemaic kings and queens as one of their names, and established her lineage as part of the Macedonian ruling family. And again, I don't know if that's the case at all, but I was trying to understand why many of the epithets given to her of chaste and unmarried had to do with priestess qualities. And at the same time, it was clear that, as I said, her education was not in astrology, was not through Egyptian temples.
Yeah, I mean, I think that she, if she wanted to pursue a profession as an astrologer, then that might have been a choice of hers that she had to make. That, if she had gotten married, she would have been expected to do all these other things, like run a household or have children or different things like that. Whereas I think one of the implications in the paper that the researchers were headed was that she remained unmarried and all those other things in order to pursue her specific career as an astrologer.
Right. But in order to do that, she would have had to have the permission of her family, because many women did not have the choice of whether or not they got married, that was an expectation, a cultural expectation. Their father's like, hey, we're not going to support you any longer. You've got to go get married. So she needed the permission of her family not to marry, and she needed the ongoing financial support of the family to continue being involved in a profession, because otherwise she would have it would have been her husband's job to support her financially. And one could wonder, was she self-supporting as an astrologer receiving clients? Well, that's a fascinating possibility. I don't know enough about the social customs to explore if that was in the realm of what was feasible at that time.
Yeah, well, I mean, the really close possible parallel here is Hypatia, who also in Alexandria, Egypt, a little bit later, she was in the late 4th or early 5th century. She died in the year 415 CE. She was the daughter of the famous, or not famous, but somewhat prominent astronomer Theon of Alexandria, who wrote commentaries on the astronomical works of Ptolemy, his Almagest, as well as his handy tables, some of which he wrote explicitly because he said there were astrologers that wanted to understand better how to use those tables. And so he was writing some of these commentaries to help facilitate that. So Hypatia learned and became really good at mathematics and astronomy and potentially philosophy partially through being able to learn that with her father in Alexandria, and then they may have collaborated together. One of the manuscripts says that she collaborated with him on one of his commentaries on Ptolemy. So sometimes women in the ancient world would have that connection, even though they weren't usually afforded the same education as men. There were some context, especially through a father or other family connections, where they could have learned that stuff.
Yes.
But Hypatia is also a good parallel also because she also has similar connections in terms of like being unmarried and having some of similar qualities potentially of potentially being like a virgin or other things like that, being associated with her and being independent in that way. Because I think one of the things not being married, allowed somebody was having independence and having self-determination.
Right. And having a life that was not centered around bearing and raising children and feeding the family, which took up all of women's time.
Right. Yeah. So, and it also reminds me of how, like, even Valens in the 2nd century and some of the Hermetic material really talks about, like, he talks about how he didn't focus on, gambling and all these other things that he viewed as like materialistic distractions. And instead, he focused on his single-minded pursuit of astrology and the study of the stars and the planets. And he really, makes this like a central part of his ethical, almost like qualifications as an astrologer. And I wonder if somebody like Heliodora living in Egypt in the same time period would have had similar, philosophical or ethical sort of like feelings in terms of her dedication to the subject.
Right. No, I think you're absolutely right with that. And that she did obviously dedicate her life to that. And that chances are what astrology, how she learned astrology, most certainly came through family connection of a father, brother, some relative, and having a family that valued women's education and that allowed her to pursue the life that she did.
Right. Yeah. Well, and that's what was interesting is one of the epithets she was given was sibling loving or brother loving. And so on other in other tombs, there's similar epithets for people that are like husband loving or that they were child loving, that they loved their children. But for her, she had some kind of connection with her siblings, and that perhaps, it potentially could have been her siblings burying her since she was only 52 years old. So maybe it could have been through them that she had either the financial support or that she had the support of her family to somehow pursue this career as an astrologer.
Yeah, I think that would have been essential, that she had familial support in both learning and pursuing the career.
All right. So
but nevertheless, she must have been very esteemed and respected and part of a notable family for the word mathematike to be inscribed on her tombstone and recognized as such, because as you started off saying, professions weren't usually part of the inscriptions on one's tomb. So it was special that it was, and she must have had a certain amount of status or power or connections to have that even happen in the first place. So you wonder what her reputation was in her lifetime in order to merit that on her tombstone.
Yeah, I mean, that she would have been an astrologer seeing clients. She would have been reading people's birth charts in this little small to mid-sized town in Egypt in like the 2nd or 3rd century. And that also means she would have had access to not just, verbal teachings potentially from whoever her teacher was, but also from texts. Like she would have had some of the texts that were common in that time period, which would have been some of the earlier texts, like maybe the texts attributed to Hermes or Asclepius or Nicepso and Petasiris. by the 2nd or 3rd century, she could have even also had access to like the poem of Dorotheus that taught natal astrology and electional astrology. Even, you know, if she was a little bit later, she could have even had access to like the texts of Valens or the texts of Ptolemy.
Right. Or because it was such a juncture of trade and commerce, of people who had been attending Valens classes in Alexandria, like coming through and talking about this lecture that they heard last week, and being able to partake of a network of the popularity of astrology at that time and the flow of communication. And she was in a place where there would have been a lot of flow of ideas and peoples passing through.
Yeah. And so she would have had those texts. She would have had like the delineation texts, like that tell you how to interpret certain combinations, because there's just like so many combinations that everybody needs those initial sort of guidebooks, at least at one point early in their studies, to learn what different aspects or placements mean. And then she also probably would have done charts. She would have done the calculations for charts, maybe on a piece of papyrus, but archaeologists have found these different astrological boards that they think that astrologers probably used in order to do actual consultations. And I'm hoping to do an episode on this pretty soon, but here's a image for the video viewers of one of the more famous ones that's like a wooden board that almost looks like a chessboard, and then on the inside it has the 12 signs of the zodiac, and on the outside it has the decans and the bounds or terms. And astrologers would have used a stone for each of the planets in order to recreate the person's birth chart on the table for the consultation. So that's something definitely she would have used.
Right. So there are a lot of tools and resources available to her at that time.
Right. And then going back to, you mentioned the family connections, and it makes me think of somebody who also potentially would have been her contemporary, who was Paul of Alexandria, or Paulus Alexandrinus, who lived around the year 378 CE in Egypt, probably in Alexandria. And he actually wrote his textbook, his Introduction to Astrology, to his son. And in his text, he includes his son's birth chart, essentially.
Right. So you're speaking to the tradition of parents passing on their professions to their children.
Yeah, I thought that might be a good segue to talk about like family lineages.
Yeah. Right. So you want to get into Julia Babila yet, or you're making your way to somewhere else?
No, that's a good. So let's talk about Thrasyllus and Belbilus and that whole family line of astrologers, which is one of the most prominent and long-running family lines of astrologers that we know about, that stretches from the 1st century BCE all the way through the 2nd century CE.
Right. And so when Chris and I first spoke about doing this presentation, we both started doing a little search for clues as to other women astrologers, if they existed, or women connected with astrology. And we came across the name of Julia Babila, who lived probably at the same time of Heliodora. And Julia Babila was the great granddaughter of Thrasyllus, who was Emperor Tiberius's astrologer. And this story, tracing this lineage, is part of my, personal story of like tramping around through Greece, looking at different sites with the guidebook. And it was in the early 2000s that I was wandering about Athens with Scott Silverman and Carmen Miller. And part of our itinerary that day was going to this monument called the Philopapus Monument that was on top of the Hill of the Muses, because it had a great view and one could see the Acropolis in the distance that was on another hill across the way. And so we found the path and wound our way up there. And then as we're looking at the monument, I looked at the base and I saw that the person whom the monument was dedicated to was both a prince of the area of Commagene, and that it was dedicated by his sister Julia Babila. And that just started ringing off bells in my head, because I knew that Commagene was an area in southern Turkey that was ruled over by Hellenistic kings in the aftermath of Alexander the Great. And that family had strong astrological interests. In the earliest Greek horoscope, which was the line of Commagene, that was the coronation chart of the first king Antiochus, came from there. And so
here's an image of it.
Right. So that part was interesting. And then Julia,
so could you expand on the lion horoscope part?
Yes.
So here's an image of it for those watching the video version.
Yeah, go ahead, Chris. Why don't you talk about the conjunction of the planets in Leo?
So it's just, there's this relief, this stone monument that was found in modern day Turkey from this line of kings of Commagene. And one of the early ones, it has a depiction of a lion, which is Leo, with stars in it and the moon on its chest. And then it has 3 stars above it that are written in Greek. It writes out the names of those stars, which you can see them just at the top. And researchers have been able to, the dates are kind of debated, but basically date it to sometime in the 1st century BCE, maybe as early as 100 BCE, or maybe a few decades later, but around that time period. And because it's written in Greek, this then becomes one of the earliest recorded sort of charts, or astrological charts, essentially, that depict an actual astrological alignment that occurred perhaps at the coronation of this specific king.
Right. So I knew that that place name had astrological connections, and it the inscription indicated that the Roman citizen Julia Babila, who was his sister, had helped dedicate and build this monument to her brother. And that triggered off the name of Babylas, who is a famous court astrologer in Rome. So that sent me researching and discovering her lineage. And many of your listeners may have come across the name of Thrasyllus before, as being one of the very early Hellenistic astrologer who was the friend and astrologer to Emperor Tiberius, and guided him through the entirety of Tiberius's rule as a Roman emperor. And at a certain point, and Thrasyllus came from Egypt. He was a scholar there. In a scholarly work, he wrote the whole compilation and arrangement of all of Plato's books that is still used today. So he was a heavyweight in his own right. And at a certain point, while Tiberius was emperor, they gave Thrasyllus a bride who is a princess, a royal princess of Commagene, whose family had astrological interests. And Chris had just showed you the coronation piece of the first Antiochus king. So here we have the emergence of the court astrologer to Tiberius, the royal family of Commagene, and their son was Babylas. Babylas was trained in astrology by his father Thrasyllus.
Which, hold on, just by the way, is kind of just like crazy that Thrasyllus is the astrologer to Tiberius. He becomes the astrologer to the second Roman emperor, basically. Tiberius was the second Roman emperor after the transition of the Roman Republic to the imperial period. And then that once Tiberius became emperor, that he arranged this marriage for Thrasyllus to like a princess from this major royal line from modern day Turkey, and that it was from an astrological family or a family that has documented astrological interests. So it's like the merging of two astrological family lines in Thrasyllus, who is one of the highest ranking astrologers in history, right at the beginning of the 1st century CE. Like there's just narratively and historically something incredibly interesting about that.
Right. It's fascinating that for my astrologer, I'm going to get you a royal princess whose family is aligned with your interests.
Right.
Right.
And that they would then start a family line of astrologers.
Right. And Thrasyllus also was friends with Augustus and would often be invited to Augustus's dinner parties where he would converse with the guests. So he was, in the highest echelons.
Which means what's funny about that also is he probably would have known Manilius, who's writing his astrological text either towards the end of Augustus's reign or the beginning of Tiberius's. So it's like Thrasyllus and Manilius are like contemporaries in the same circles of power in Rome.
So they have a son, Babylas, who then on Tiberius's Thrasyllus died a year before Tiberius did, and then Claudius became the next emperor, and Babylas became court emperor to Claudius, court astrologer to Babylas. And then there's a gap where, and also to Nero as well. But there was a gap, that must have been Caligula that was the gap in there. And Babylas gets sent to Egypt, where in Egypt he becomes the head of the library of Alexandria. And he also becomes prefect of Egypt, which is like being the governor of the whole Roman province of Egypt. So here you have the son of an astrologer himself holding an extremely high, both academic title as head librarian and political title as governor. When this space, and then Babylas marries a woman in Egypt. They have a daughter, Claudia, who is then married to another prince of Commagene. So Babylas's child likewise receives a royal marriage from an astrological family. And from them come Julia Babyla, who we'll get to soon, and Philopappus, whose monument we went to visit. And before I totally get to Julia, it was this idea that the great-grandson of Thrasyllus, the grandson of Babylas, has a monument on a hill in Athens that says the same height as the Acropolis is. And the emanations of this astrological family continue to waft over the city and the country. And very few people actually have traced down Philopappus's astrological connections, but they're there. So Babylas, pull up the monument.
Yeah, just to give people context, because there's a whole Wikipedia entry on it, and it has some of the images. Like first it shows that it's on top of this hill.
The Hill of the Muses, where the ancient seer Musaeon was said to be buried, who was a prophet and a seer. So this monument is sitting upon the legendary seer.
Okay. And then also I know you wanted me to show the family tree.
Yeah.
from Frederick Kramer's book, Astrology in Roman Law
Yeah.
and Politics.
Yeah.
So this
So,
shows Thrasyllus marries, we think that her name was Akka,
mhm.
Princess of Commagene, somewhere around, Kramer thinks around 2 AD or 2 CE. Then they have a child, which is Balbillus,
Another great astrologer.
right? The famous astrologer Balbillus that serves a bunch of Roman emperors, becomes the governor of Egypt and
Yeah.
the head of the Library of Alexandria. And then they have children.
They have
Um,
the daughter Claudia,
mhm,
and her first marriage is with with Julius Antiochus Epiphanes of Commagene. So she marries another prince, son of a king, from which Julia and her brother Philopappus are born.
got it. So, and then Philopappus is the one who is that the monument is dedicated to,
Mhm.
and in the dedication it was partially by the people of Athens, but also by
Mhm.
his sister Julia Balbilla,
Right,
who died somewhere after 130 CE.
right. Okay,
Okay.
right. So by the time Julia is born, um, she is being raised in Rome under the patronage of the Emperor Vespasian, for whom her grandfather Babylas is the court astrologer. Babylas was Vespasian's astrologer for the length of his reign. And so she was said to have received a superb education under Vespasian's patronage. Then, in short order, after Vespasian's death, there are 3 emperors that all disappear in a year. And then we have the reign of Hadrian. And Hadrian was known for his astrological interests, and Julia becomes part of Hadrian's entourage. So why don't you say a few words about Hadrian before we bring the story of what Julia does to a close?
I mean, the only thing I have is just that Hadrian, he's one of the few emperors whose birth chart survives, and it's preserved in the text of, it's from an astrologer named Antigonus of Nicaea, and it's preserved in the text of Hephaestus of Thebes. So it's one of the few emperors where we actually have their surviving birth chart. What were the other things you wanted to mention about
Well, he
Hadrian?
was an astrologer, and that he would do his solar return every year himself.
Hmm.
So he is one of the emperors, not only he may have had court astrologers, but he himself had learned the art of astrology and used it in understanding his reign year by year. Okay,
Right.
right. So then Hadrian invites Julia to be part of his court. Perhaps she was a lady in waiting to his wife or his wife's companion, and she lived in the court and traveled with them. And one of their trips was to Egypt and to Thebes and the Valley of the Kings, where so many of the Egyptian pharaohs were buried, and Thebes was a major spiritual center. And Julia's education led her to become a poet, and she was asked to inscribe verses of her poetry into the statue of a great Egyptian pharaoh Menon, which is a colossal statue that exists in Egypt. And it was somewhere on his legs that she inscribed 3 epigrams, 3 verses, and right down in here. And the final verse was the lines And do you have that you can show the final lines acknowledging her parents?
Yeah,
Keep going down.
she mentions them twice.
Oh.
So she says,
Yeah. Right.
She
said, go ahead.
She says, but I do not believe that this statue of yours will perish. I saved your immortal spirit forever with my mind. For my parents were noble, and my grandfathers, the wise Balbillus and Antiochus the king. And then later they are again mentions in a third epigram where she says, for pious were my parents and grandfathers, Balbillus the wise and King Antiochus. Balbillus, the father of my mother of royal blood, and King Antiochus, the father of my father. From their line, I too draw my noble blood, and these verses are mine, pious Balbilla.
Okay. So that is, in some ways, it's stunning for a couple of reasons that she was able to immortalize the name of her astrologer grandfather Babylos into enduring monument in Egypt that was connected to an Egyptian royal dynasty, especially because Babylos himself, like Thrasyllus, came from Egypt. He was governor of Egypt. He was the head of the Alexandrian library, and she was able to record his name for posterity, which in ancient times there was not widespread belief in reincarnation. The way that one achieved immortality was that one's name be remembered after one's death, and that she was able to sort of enshrine for the ages. But secondly, that in Rome itself, she was had both noble blood and the blood of a whole lineage of the most elevated astrologers. And whether or not she herself was an astrologer, we don't know, but certainly she had been immersed in that kind of thinking and that kind of knowledge, and that she then became, in her own right, part of a royal court that shows the status to which a woman who both had astrological and royal lineage could achieve in the course of her lifetime.
Yeah.
Right.
And the royal court of a king, of an emperor who was also a practitioner or a fan of astrology. Right.
So he was said, oh yeah, you're, Thrasyllus and Babylos's heir, of course you should be part of my court. But then she was also a royal princess from the other side of her line.
And this is in the year 130 CE. So this is about almost 100 years after Thrasyllus died in 36 CE. So it would be like today you have like Rob Hand. If Rob Hand was like the astrologer to Obama, 10 years ago, and then 100 years from now, if like Rob Hand had a great granddaughter who was then the poet, or then was connected to a president like 100 years from now who was also into astrology.
Right. And she went to a huge statue and inscribed Rob's name into it to make sure like it wouldn't be forgotten.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Yeah. So we also see that she also could have been a contemporary with Heliodora. So we have like two examples of women connected with astrological knowledge and lineage who must have been living or functioning at a high status level in their respective worlds. And it also speaks to the status that astrology had at a certain period of time during the second, third century.
Right. Yeah. And it also really brings up and brings into focus the idea of family lineages of astrologers, both in the Greco-Roman tradition, but also we have to remember back in the Mesopotamian tradition, 1,000 years before that, where astrology is like really originating, the earlier versions of astrology. We already know that there were these family lineages of astrologers and sky watchers, and that these astrologers would go out every night and observe the stars and record their positions over the courses of hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And then some of them became the astrologers to specific kings and would send their reports to
Yes.
kings. And we know sometimes that these positions were passed on from generation to generation, usually from father to son. But I think it's impossible within that context of having like a family of astrologers that some of that knowledge isn't also talked about in the household, and that some of the daughters would have also learned astrology and even practiced it to some extent within that context.
Right. So just quickly, in the hymns of Enheduanna, going back to 2000 BC, inscribed on the cuneiform tablets was that she consulted, she measures off the heavens, she looks at the stars and measures off the heavens. So we have this notion of women astronomers going back to the earliest of the Sumerian-Babylonian history. And then, do you want to say a few words about Buran as also being part of a lineage? Are we there yet?
I mean, I think that's another. I mean, I did so much already on that episode with Ali that I'll probably just link to it in the description below this episode, and people should search for the for Queen Buran, astrologer is the episode I did. But yeah, just that she was connected with, again, another family lineage of really prominent astrologers in Baghdad in the 8th and 9th centuries, and that she also, there were legends of her practicing astrology and using it in different, very interesting ways. Yeah, so family lineages. And then also one of the things I was thinking about recently is, you and I both learned yesterday about the death of an astrologer, a woman that we both knew named Ellen Black, who was one of the founders of Project Hindsight, and she was the wife of the translator Robert Schmidt, who's one of the major figures that helped to revive Hellenistic astrology in the 1990s and 2000s through the work of Project Hindsight and through their partnership with Robert Hand and Robert Zoller and a number of other scholars and astrologers that's led to, both you and I writing our books eventually on Hellenistic astrology, and the way that some of that's transformed the astrological community over the past 30 years. So we were both sad to learn of Ellen's passing this past Wednesday. I meant to say is May 15th, 2023. But also just you and I know, because we were there, that, Ellen was the one that originally was interested in astrology in the 1980s and got Schmidt interested in it and told him that this is a subject that there was something there and it was worth looking into, even though his background up to that point was in ancient mathematics and philosophy and classics and things like that. She was the one that got him into astrology, and then she was also the one that played a pivotal role in doing like the marketing for Project Hindsight, and I'm sure innumerable other things that might not be recognized because she was sort of it was part of her partnership with Schmidt, or there were things that were done behind the scenes that people won't know about. And I'm sure that's also a really common theme when it comes to women, and that notion of like, women behind, powerful men or what have you, not having their contributions recognized.
Right. Exactly. So, and and I'm glad we're saying this is in this part of the episode, we know that Ellen did many things behind the scenes. One of them that I remember, that she was very skilled in getting librarians all over the world to send her copies of manuscripts of the astrological texts, as well as critical editions that were very difficult to obtain, so that Bob was able to translate, having the resources that he needed. And that was one of the things that is relatively unrecognized, but we saw that happen and was an essential piece of what Project Hindsight was eventually able to do.
Right. And she was the one that would actually like photocopy some of those
Right.
critical editions,
Right.
which then Schmidt and Hand and Zoller would
Yeah.
translate from.
Yes.
So that's also probably a major theme, just in terms of the history of astrology as well, is that the number of different women that played major roles whose names have been lost, but were nonetheless major contributing factors in the history of astrology.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, there is evidence that the discovery of Uranus was by Caroline Herschel, which is William Herschel's sister.
Mm.
Right. And there are books now on women astronomers where that is brought forth, but for the most part, that piece is glossed over. And so we see the continuity of that practice.
Right. Yeah. And Hypatia was another one where it's like, we don't fully know. We know, or we think that she helped or contributed with her father to some of the commentaries that they did, or may have co-authored together, but what role, we can't really say. And then eventually things by the modern period start to change eventually. And by the 20th century, you start getting, some of the most prominent astrologers in the world are women, and that the astrological community is being led and shaped by women in really significant ways in the 20th century.
Right. It's very interesting topic of how in the previous to the 20th century, virtually all of the names of astrologers that we have are men. There are very few. We've pulled forth the names of a couple of women here, but throughout the Arabic time period, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance into the early modern, we have men are the practitioners and the authors of texts. And then it's not until the 20th century where, for various reasons, whether it was due to the gap in the transmission of the traditional approach or the reshaping of astrology into being more of a psychological and esoteric art, that we see the entrance of women into astrology, where now, if we look at the astrological conferences and our clients and who shows up on Zoom talks, most of the participants are women, and there are many women astrologers themselves, and the client base is filled with women, so that there has been a transition that's happened in the last 120 years of who are the astrologers, who are both the creators, the practitioners of astrology, and who are the recipients and clients and students of astrology.
Right. And I did an episode 137 of the astrology podcast. I did on Elsbeth Eberton, and it was titled Elsbeth Eberton and the Rise of Women in Astrology, with Jen Zart, who had done a lot of work on Elsbeth Eberton, who was like the father of Reinhold Eberton, and who was the major astrologer in Germany in the early 20th century. And is a good example of that shift and that trend, which eventually by the time of the 1960s, in 1968, we get the publication of like Linda Goodman's Sun Signs book, and that becomes one of the highest selling astrology books of all time, which has just sold millions and millions of
Right.
copies. So that's a big shift from before that, maybe the text of like, Claudius Ptolemy being the highest selling astrology book of all time, or what have you.
Yeah.
As well as the, publication of more advanced technical works by, other people like Liz Green, or you and your work on the asteroids, and then subsequently Hellenistic astrology and different things like that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So in general, I don't know if we can say that with the increased opportunities for the education of women, and even back in 1830, there were no like free colleges for women. There was someone in New York who instituted the first college for women. So it's only with the widespread education and literacy of women as a body, and in the 60s, when many receiving the vote and then having more professions open up for them, that we could see the talents of women having an environment that was encouraging and receptive for them to bring forth their knowledge and insights. And so I think there were many factors that allowed for the entrance of women into the field that didn't exist socially in earlier time periods.
Right. And one thing I should say is also, while we know for sure that that's like the majority, or that's the major emphasis of things, there's still a lot about history that we don't know, partially because there was this filtering mechanism to some extent in terms of the transmission of the texts that survived and made it through the medieval tradition, just because text had to be copied over by hand from scribes, and only a small percentage of the texts in the ancient world that were written actually survived through to modern times. And I know new work is being done on this subject and new discoveries are being made. I know that Ali Alumi is working on some research about other notable women in the Arabic astrological tradition and the Islamic tradition, that were maybe not recognized very much until recently, that he's going to be publishing.
Wonderful.
And I also talked to, on Twitter, an astrologer from India, and asked him, when I made the post about chart calculation, he said, this is from Saruba Sharma, he said, in Sanskrit texts too, a word is often used for astrologer is Ganaka, which means arithmetician. And he says there's a very early example of this. So he was noting that basically there's a parallel in the Indian tradition with using, where the Greek and Latin astrologers were using mathematike or mathematician, that you had something similar in the Sanskrit texts. So when I asked him about the earliest reference to women practicing astrology in India, he said, the oldest reference I know of is Queen Chandra Devi, consort of King Paragupta, 467 through 473 CE, who was skilled in reading and writing horoscopes according to 7th century Chinese sources. But then he goes on to say that women in ancient India received education in all traditional subjects, including Vedangas like Jyotisha or astrology.
Yeah.
So, the situation may have been different in different cultures. And what we've tried to focus on for the most part here is just the references that we know of in the Greco-Roman or Greco-Egyptian tradition, especially while we have some of those allusions and other references that are a little uncertain, that Heliodora is like the first one that we know her name, and we know that she was a professional astrologer. And that in that way, it makes her unique, but it means it's also sort of like the tip of the iceberg in terms of a lot of other things that we just don't have documentation of.
Right. Yeah, with ongoing archaeological discoveries that are happening, that we expect that there'll be more, and we hope that they will be uncovered. We will get to see them.
Yeah. And that's
right. If there's one, that means there's got to be more than one.
Right. Yeah, and
Yeah.
that's a really important point that there have been a string of really striking archaeological
Yeah.
discoveries over the past few years that are starting to change our understanding of the
Mhm.
history of astrology. This discovery of
Yeah.
Heliodora's tomb is one of them, but also last month, part of what made me notice this or find this article by Alexander Jones talking about Heliodora was that he published another article where a lost work, a lost text of Claudius Ptolemy had been rediscovered
Mhm.
after they used X-rays in order to X-ray another manuscript where somebody had written over and erased over a work of Ptolemy's. And so they were able to reconstruct a
Mhm.
lost work of
Mhm.
Ptolemy's based on this new
Right,
technology.
right.
Or elsewhere, there were excavations and they found horoscopes written in Demotic Egyptian just in 2021
Mhm.
that contained new things and contained some of the earliest birth charts that survived, which, as I said earlier, some of them were charts cast for women. So there's new archaeological discoveries being made all the time, and there's still a lot of work to do, and there will probably be new discoveries in the future.
Right. So we hope that some of our astrological community will move themselves into studies and disciplines where they can be part of this process of uncovering and discovery and um, bringing more of our tradition into light and focus.
Yeah, and that's part of what you did is in the 19 you were an astrologer by training and by profession and practice, but in the 1990s you went back to school and got a degree in classics and learned Greek and Latin so that you
Mhm.
could access some of this tradition and learn it and work with it.
Exactly. And it was such an incredibly enriching experience that it took my astrology in a direction that it would never, ever have gone without that training and education I received in the languages and the history of the ancient time period. And in some ways, it was because I had learned to read and translate ancient Greek that Robert Schmidt helped me create a course for Kepler students in the Hellenistic astrology.
Right. And then you
Right. And then
became
from that, like all kinds of things emerge from those initial years where that was taught and the students and the work that has happened as a result of that dissemination.
yeah, and then that actually is really that brings things full circle because then
Yeah.
you became the first one of the first teachers to actually teach Hellenistic astrology from 2000 years ago, from Heliodora's time period,
Mm-hmm.
the very first people to teach
Right.
that to students in an
Right.
astrology school in modern times, after over 1,000 years or almost 2,000
Yeah.
years from when that astrology first
Mm.
originated.
Right. So that's part of like the lineage, whether it's blood lineage or not. I often see astrology as this like living chain of light. And each of us individually is gifted with being able to receive the light of astrology for a certain period of time during our life. And then we've received it from someone and then we pass it on to someone else. And that's how we have kept the tradition flowing. The Jyotisha in India, they call astrology, the science of light. And it is the light that's being passed forth through all of the various practitioners. So it's like a real gift to, even have a small toehold in that ring. Mm.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah,
Yeah, and the passing on of that tradition that
yeah,
Heliodora was involved in. And I'm really glad now that we can recognize her. And even though we know so little about her, we know enough now that she can take her place in history
yes,
as, one of the astrologers that was part of our tradition.
right. And that, all of the contemporary women astrologers, when asked whether any ancient women astrologers can say with high degree of certainty. Yes, we know the name Heliodora, gift of the sun.
Right.
Mhm.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
All
So,
right.
yeah. So another one of the traditions that I hope to pass on now is the course I'm going to teach this summer through Astrology University and how to hand calculate a chart.
Yes, that's really important. So that before that is lost, and because that provides such an important piece of the tradition that had always been there, which is the ability to know what you're
Right.
doing when you're calculating charts and what the astronomy is that it's based on.
Yeah. So, I spent really the whole, since last fall, almost a year developing it so that it's complete and it's based on the math itself. And so simply having an ephemeris and a table of houses, in my style of going through it, painstakingly step by step with explanations and instructions and worksheets and so on, of bringing the process from time, place, and date to the constructed chart and how to calculate all the exact degrees. And in the process, what became part of my own new learning was integrating some of the astronomy of the great circles into each lesson. So when you're calculating the midheaven, it's like for years, like, oh yeah, the midheaven is where the local meridian intersects the ecliptic. Well, what exactly does that mean? Well, I could point to it on a diagram, but when I went out into the sky and looked up in the sky, it's like, well, what am I looking at? And so that started me off on trying to understand the conceptual framework. So when we get to the calculation of the midheaven, the calculation of the ascendant, or a declination, like what is it exactly that these numbers that you're crunching, what do they represent actually in the physicality of the celestial sphere that surrounds us? So I've done that, and that after I completed the course, Tony said to me, he said, "Oh, could you do a bonus lesson on how to use the tables?" And I said, "Okay, well, I need to revise certain sections of it so that it becomes more amenable." So I unpacked a lot of what I did and restructured it. So then you can also learn how to learn interpolation tables that shortcut some of the steps. But if you don't have the tables, I'm actually teaching you how to do it without the tables. And if you simply know how to add and subtract and multiply and divide, and if you can't do it longhand, if you just have a little hand calculator to do that, that you can generate the chart. And what's important is not just being able to generate the chart. What's important is preserving a lineage that can be passed on. So all of the things that we're saying about the lineage that gets passed on, knowing how to do the chart was the first and primary act of being an astrologer. And that has merit in some people knowing it and then being able to teach it to other people, and how it is that that can be done with the most rudimentary of the resources.
Right. And that was part of being a mathematike.
Right. That's what doing the numbers, so to speak, entailed. So that course will start July 17th. It'll be offered through Astrology University. And if you sign up on my mailing list through my website, then you'll get notified when registration for that opens.
And your website is
Demetra. DemetraGeorge.com.
Got it. Okay.
Okay.
And really quickly, you were originally in college, you're studying math to be a math teacher, weren't you?
I was.
Okay.
And I got all the way through student teaching, and I had to take a few more humanity classes, one of which was philosophy of science. And then all of a sudden, like, I got to year 5 and I switched my major to philosophy because that happened. But
Right.
I did have a math major, and I tutored classical physics as a young college student.
It's funny then how things come full circle.
Full circle.
Right. All right. And then you're giving a workshop at the Northwest Astrology Conference later this month, right?
I am. It's just in 2 weeks now that NORWAC will happen. It will be a workshop on mitigations in Hellenistic planetary condition. So what I've realized is a lot of people now, knowing a little bit of Hellenistic astrology, look at their chart and like, go, oh my God, like I have something that's like really terrible in my chart. And the classes on, there's so much of that assessment, so many factors are involved, it's relative, but then there's also a whole list of other factors that mitigate what you may think is a difficult situation that you have with the planet, that suppress it, prevent it, transform it into a source of good. And so laying out how to recognize those mitigating factors. And so the first part I'll be giving, laying out the principles. And then the second part, I will be taking examples from the audience. And so the audience members will be both those that are there in person, and the conference is being offered virtually, and we'll also be taking examples from the virtual attendees. And so there is time to, I think there may be still a few places left for full registration. For the workshops, you don't have to be registered for the main conference if you want to attend in person. And then if you can't get there in person and you want to do it virtually, you can go to the NORWAC website. And it will be Friday morning, I think the 26th of May at, we just see my calendar. Yes, the 26th of May at 9 a.m. So,
all right. So people can find out more information about that at norwac.net. They can go to your website, demetrageorge.com. And if they sign up for your mailing list, then they'll get notified when that chart calculation course comes out next month, as well as when you sell the recording of the mitigations workshop from NORWAC after that conference is over. Right. And then I think later this year, you're also doing an asteroids workshop.
I'm doing a 3-day asteroid retreat in Palm Springs the first weekend of December. And this will be, and I'm giving some asteroid lectures in the fall, one for the EA community and another one for the Astromagica community. And for the retreat, everyone will get their 23,000 asteroid list. And I will take the participants through the process of how to find the mythic and the name and place asteroids that are most significant in their chart, and then how to be able to research if they're mythological, what they mean, and draw psychological and archetypal and practical meaning from that. So now that the huge push with Hellenistic, I'm on the other side of it, I'd like to do a little bit more with the amazing mind-bending places that the asteroids can take us to.
Nice.
Okay.
Yeah, and balancing things out and having a foot in both worlds, in the ancient and the modern worlds.
Yeah, and so much of the mythic asteroids, like I'm still in the ancient world. I'm still working with the mythologies of ancient cultures and how those myths are totally relevant and speak to the dramas, the eternal dramas that people still go through. So even though I'm looking at, new planetary bodies rather than the old 7 visible, it still is connected to the ancient classical studies.
Right. Awesome. Brilliant. All right. Well, that's exciting. I'll put links to your website in the description below this video or on the podcast website so people can go there for more information. But otherwise, thanks for joining me today to talk about Heliodora.
Yeah, I'm thrilled that we were able to do this today, and that we all now will know her name. Okay.
Yeah. All right.
Okay.
Well, thanks everyone for watching or listening to this episode of the Astrology Podcast, and we'll see you again next time.
Bye.
Special thanks to all the patrons that helped to support the production of this episode of the podcast through our page on patreon.com. In particular, shout out to the patrons on our producers tier, including Thomas Miller, Catherine Conroy, Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Issa Sabah, Jake Otero, Mimi Stargazer, and Jean-Marie Kaplan. If you appreciate the work I'm doing here on the podcast and you'd like to find a way to support it, then please consider becoming a patron through our page on patreon.com. In exchange, you can get access to bonus content that's only available to patrons of the podcast, such as early access to new episodes, the ability to attend the live recording of the monthly forecast episodes, our monthly auspicious elections podcast, or another exclusive podcast series called the Casual Astrology Podcast, or you can even get your name listed in the credits at the end of each episode. For more information, visit patreon.com/astrologypodcast. If you're looking to get an astrological consultation, we have a list of recommended astrologers at theastrologypodcast.com/consultations. The astrologers on the list are friends of the podcast that have been featured in different episodes over the years, and they have different specialties such as natal astrology, electional astrology, synastry, rectification, or horary astrology. You can get a 10% discount when you book a consultation with one of the astrologers on our list by using the promo code AstrologyPodcast. The astrology software that we use and recommend here on the podcast is called SolarFire for Windows, which is available for the PC at alabe.com. Use the promo code AP15 to get a 15% discount. For Mac users, we recommend a software program called AstroGold for Mac OS, which is from the creators of SolarFire for PC, and it includes both modern and traditional techniques. You can find out more information at astrogold.io, and you can use the promo code AstroPodcast15 to get a 15% discount. If you'd like to learn more about my approach to astrology, then I'd recommend checking out my book titled Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune, where I go over the history, philosophy, and techniques of ancient astrology, taking people from beginner up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. You can get a print copy of the book through Amazon or other online retailers, or there's an ebook version available through Google Books. If you're really looking to expand your studies of astrology, then I would recommend my Hellenistic Astrology course, which is an online course on ancient astrology where I take people through basic concepts up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. There's over 100 hours of video lectures as well as guided readings of ancient texts, and by the time you finish the course, you will have a strong foundation in how to read birth charts as well as make predictions. You can find out more information at courses.theastrologyschool.com. And finally, thanks to our sponsors, including the Mountain Astrologer magazine, which is a quarterly astrology magazine which you can read in print or online at mountainastrologer.com.